Welcome to Silent Screams, where darkness, whispers, and terror await you. Are you ready to confront your fears? Story 1: The Curse of Marionette Manor. Lila Montrose had never set foot in Marionette Manor. A crumbling Victorian estate her estranged great-aunt Agnes left her in her will. The terms of inheritance were clear. Lila had to spend 1 full month living in the manor to claim it. Desperate for a financial breakthrough, she reluctantly agreed, unaware that the house harbored a macabre secret. The first time Lila stepped into the grand parlor, the cold air prickled her skin. The room was unervingly ornate: gold-trimmed mirrors, velvet curtains, and hundreds of porcelain dolls arranged neatly on the shelves. Their glassy eyes seemed to follow her every move. A handwritten note lay on a nearby table. The dolls must never leave their places. Disturb them, and they will disturb you. Lila laughed nervously, dismissing the warning as eccentric paranoia. But as the days went on, the dolls began to feel less like decorations and more like silent watchers. The first night, Lila woke to the sound of faint whispers. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding. The room was empty, yet she swore she heard something: soft, childlike voices calling her name. The next morning, she found a doll on her nightstand that hadn't been there before. It was a tiny figure in a tattered blue dress, with a cracked porcelain face and one eye missing. "Who put you here?" Lila muttered, placing the doll back on the shelf. But every time she entered a room, the dolls seemed to have shifted slightly. She rationalized it as her imagination. But the whispers persisted, growing louder each night. One evening, while dusting the shelves, she accidentally knocked over a doll with fiery red hair. Its glass face shattered upon hitting the floor. A cold gust swept through the room, and the whispers turned into shrill cries. "You've broken her," the voices shrieked. Lila screamed, dropping the broom. The air turned heavy, and the room darkened as though the house itself had come alive. When the lights flickered back on, the shattered doll was gone, replaced by a new one, a replica of Lila, complete with her auburn hair and green eyes. Terrified, Lila decided to search for answers. She found an old diary belonging to Aunt Agnes hidden in the attic. Its pages brittle and stained. The entries revealed a chilling tale. Agnes had been a doll-maker, renowned for her lifelike creations. But her craft was far from innocent. She had struck a deal with a shadowy entity to imbue the dolls with fragments of human souls, stolen from unwitting townsfolk. "The dolls sustain me," Agnes wrote, "but they demand loyalty. Those who anger them will suffer." As Lila read, the attic door slammed shut behind her. Footsteps creaked across the floorboards, though no one was there. The dolls on the shelves began to sway, their heads tilting toward her in unison. One doll, larger than the rest, tumbled from a shelf and landed at her feet. Its painted lips moved, whispering, "You shouldn't have come here." By the third week, Lila was desperate to leave. She packed her belongings and bolted for the door. But the house wouldn't let her go. The front door refused to open, no matter how hard she pulled. Windows that had been unlocked were now sealed shut. The whispers turned into mocking laughter, echoing from the walls. The dolls began appearing in places they shouldn't: on the kitchen counter, inside her closet, even under her bed. One night, she awoke to find the doll resembling her sitting at the foot of her bed, its head tilted, and in a voice eerily similar to her own. It said, "Stay with us forever." Lila hurled the doll against the wall. But it didn't break. Instead, it stood up, its joints creaking unnaturally, and began walking toward her. Realizing she couldn't flee, Lila decided to confront the source of the curse. She returned to the attic, armed with a flashlight and the diary. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the dolls seemed to multiply, their faces contorted into grotesque expressions. In the corner of the attic, she found a locked trunk. Breaking it open, she uncovered a sinister sight, a mummified corpse clutching a porcelain doll. The diary's final entry explained everything. The corpse was Agnes, who had transferred her soul into the doll to achieve immortality. But the ritual had gone awry, trapping her in the doll forever. Destroy her, Lila whispered to herself. She grabbed a nearby hammer and smashed the doll. The moment it shattered, a deafening scream filled the air. The house shook violently, and the dolls began to disintegrate into dust. When the chaos subsided, the house was eerily quiet. The dolls were gone, and the oppressive atmosphere had lifted. Relieved, Lila left Marionette Manor, vowing never to return. But as she settled into her new apartment weeks later, she found a familiar doll sitting on her coffee table, the one that looked just like her. Its lips moved, and in a chilling whisper, it said, "You can't escape us." Story 2, The Dolls of Everwood Manor. It was a brisk autumn evening when Ella, an ambitious antique appraiser, received an unexpected letter from a lawyer. The letter contained an invitation to Everwood Manor, a decaying estate tucked away on the outskirts of the town. The lawyer's letter was vague, only mentioning the inheritance of a peculiar collection of dolls. What was most unsettling was the phrase, "These dolls have not been appraised for a reason." Curiosity overtook Ella's skepticism. She packed her bags and set off, unsure of what she would find. Everwood Manor, though magnificent in its heyday, now stood in eerie silence, its windows clouded with the passage of time. The house was cold, its walls bearing the scars of neglect. The lawyer, a thin man with sharp features, greeted her with little more than a stiff nod. "I assume you've read the letter," he said, leading her to the attic. "They've been here for generations." As Ella stepped into the attic, her eyes were immediately drawn to the collection. Dozens of porcelain dolls, all arranged meticulously on wooden shelves, stared back at her with empty, glassy eyes. Their expressions were frozen, as if waiting for something, or someone. The first night in the manor was unsettling. Ella had tried to ignore the growing sense of unease in the air. But the dolls, they were hard to forget. As the house creaked and groaned in the wind, Ella tried to sleep. But a soft whispering echoed through the floorboards. It started faintly, so subtle she could almost convince herself it was her imagination. But then, the voices grew louder. She could not make out the words, but they were unmistakable. The dolls, she realized, seemed to be murmuring, with an uneasy feeling creeping over her. Ella grabbed her flashlight and ventured back to the attic. The dolls were positioned exactly as she'd seen them earlier. But something felt different. One of the dolls, a girl dressed in a pale blue gown, was facing her, its mouth slightly agape, as if trying to speak. Ella took a hesitant step forward, her breath shallow. "This is ridiculous," she whispered to herself. "They're just dolls." But she couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching her, that they knew she was there. As she turned to leave, a loud thud echoed from behind her. Her heart skipped a beat as she spun around. But the dolls remained still, silent. Yet, a single porcelain doll had shifted on its shelf, now leaning precariously toward the edge. A subtle shift, but enough to unsettle her. The next morning, Ella tried to dismiss the events as her mind playing tricks on her. After all, the lawyer had mentioned that the dolls were old, valuable antiques. And perhaps it was the odd lighting and the creaking of the house that had unnerved her. But that evening, the atmosphere in Everwood Manor thickened. The whispers returned, now clear enough to make out distinct words. "Help, me, help," they beckoned from the attic. Against her better judgment, Ella ascended the creaking stairs once more. The dolls were eerily quiet. But one doll, the porcelain girl in the blue gown, was gone. Panic surged through her as she searched the room. Her flashlight flickered, casting shadows over the shelves. Her gaze fixed on a spot near the attic window. The doll was lying on the floor, face down. But when Ella knelt to pick it up, her hand froze. The doll's tiny hand had left a print in the dust, a handprint. A handprint that wasn't hers. Her heart raced as she clutched the doll to her chest. Was it a prank? A trick of the light? Or something far darker? Ella's investigation led her to an old journal hidden in the manor's library. The pages were yellowed and brittle, but the writing was clear. It belonged to the original owner of Everwood Manor, a woman named Marguerite Everwood, who had spent years collecting dolls from around the world. The journal entries spoke of an obsession that consumed her, a need to acquire dolls that seemed to whisper to her. It was in the final entry, however, that Ella found a chilling revelation. "I believe they are alive. The dolls speak to me when I sleep. They move when I'm not looking. I've tried to leave them, but they follow me. I can no longer escape." With this revelation, Ella felt a deep unease. The dolls were more than just objects. They were connected to something malevolent, something that had haunted this family for generations. As Ella tried to leave the manor that night, she found the door would not open. The dolls seemed to be everywhere, blocking her path, their eyes following her every movement. The whispers had grown louder, filling her mind with impossible thoughts. "I won't let you go," they seemed to say. In a panic, Ella ran back to the attic, where the dolls waited. She could hear a soft rustling behind her, footsteps on the wooden floor. As she turned, a chilling sight met her eyes. Every single doll was now standing on its feet, their glassy eyes glowing faintly in the dark. They were no longer lifeless, and their movements were jerky, as if they were awakening from a long, endless slumber. The porcelain girl in the blue gown stood at the forefront. As Ella backed away, the doll's mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. It opened its mouth, and a voice, familiar and yet not, emerged from its lips. "You shouldn't have come." Ella could feel the air around her thickening, suffocating her. The dolls began to move in unison, closing in on her, their small feet pattering against the floor. Desperation consumed her as she grabbed the nearest doll and hurled it across the room. But as the doll collided with the wall, it exploded into a cloud of dust, revealing a hidden trapdoor beneath the floor. Without thinking, Ella dove toward the trapdoor, narrowly escaping the doll's grasp. She pulled herself through the opening, slamming the door behind her, and tumbled down into the darkness. Hours later, Ella emerged from the manor, gasping for air. As she looked back at the mansion, she saw the lights flickering in the windows, and at the top of the staircase, She swore she saw the pale blue gown once again. The dolls were still waiting. Story 3, The Cursed Companion. Emily's heart raced as she stepped into the dimly lit antique shop. Dust floated in the golden light filtering through old, cracked windows, and the faint smell of mildew clung to the air. She loved places like this, the promise of forgotten treasures, each object holding a piece of someone's history. Her gaze fell upon a doll displayed in a glass case. It was unlike any she had ever seen, a porcelain face with eyes so lifelike they seemed to follow her every move. The doll wore a faded Victorian dress, its fabric frayed and yellowed with age. "That one's not for sale," the elderly shopkeeper said, his voice trembling slightly. Emily frowned. "Why display it if you're not selling?" The man hesitated, his eyes darting to the doll. "It's cursed. Everyone who's owned it has regretted it. Terrible things happen." Emily chuckled nervously. "I don't believe in curses." The shopkeeper sighed, clearly resigned. "If you insist, take it. But don't say I didn't warn you." Emily placed the doll on a shelf in her living room, admiring how it fit perfectly with her collection. That night, however, her peaceful home turned ominous. She woke to faint giggles echoing through the house. The sound was distant, almost childlike. Emily dismissed it as a dream and went back to sleep. The next morning, she found the doll sitting on her kitchen table, its head tilted slightly, as if watching her. Confused, she placed it back on the shelf, convinced she must have moved it herself and forgotten. But the incidents grew worse. Lights flickered. Her dog refused to enter the living room, growling at the doll from the doorway. She heard whispers, soft and unintelligible, but undeniably real. One night, she woke to the sensation of tiny hands brushing against her arm. Terrified, Emily decided to research the doll. She discovered a string of tragic events tied to its previous owners: fires, sudden deaths, unexplained disappearances. The doll had belonged to a little girl named Annabelle in the 1800s. After her untimely death, her grieving mother sought the help of a medium to summon her daughter's spirit. The séance went horribly wrong, binding something far darker to the doll. Emily consulted a local psychic, who confirmed her fears: the doll was a vessel for a vengeful spirit, one that thrived on fear and suffering. "You need to get rid of it," the psychic warned. Emily tried to burn the doll, but the fire extinguished itself. She buried it in the woods, only to find it sitting on her bed the next morning. The doll's porcelain face now bore cracks, and its eyes seemed darker. Desperate, Emily held a séance with the psychic. The spirit spoke through the medium in a chilling, distorted voice. "You took me in. Now, you belong to me." The doll's power surged, and chaos erupted. Furniture flew across the room, mirrors shattered, and shadows crawled up the walls. In a final act of defiance, Emily grabbed the doll and hurled it into a river. But as she turned to leave, she felt a cold hand grip her ankle. Weeks later, a new antique shop opened in town. Among its wares was a peculiar doll in a glass case, its porcelain face cracked, its eyes unyielding and watchful. Its newest owner smiled, oblivious to the curse that awaited.